welcome. Close the door behind you. Turn off the lights if you're brave enough. Because what I'm about to tell you didn't come from a horror novel or a screenplay written by someone with a wild imagination. These stories came from real places. Places you can find on a map. Places where people actually lived, and in some cases, where people actually disappeared. Tonight, we're going to the desert. Not the romantic, sunset-painted desert you see in travel magazines. Not the desert with the Instagram-worthy rock formations and the cozy bed and breakfasts. We're going to the other desert. The one that stretches so wide and so empty that the silence itself starts to feel like a presence. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes you wonder if something out there is holding its breath. The American Southwest. The Sonoran. The Mojave. The Chihuahuan. These are not just landscapes. These are burial grounds. They are places where the earth remembers things that human beings have tried very hard to forget. And scattered across them, like broken teeth jutting from cracked soil, are the towns. Some of them have names. Some of them used to have names. Some of them have streets and buildings and even a few hundred souls still clinging to existence out there in the heat and the dust. But they all share something. Every single one of them carries a story that the locals don't tell strangers right away. You have to be there a while. You have to earn it. And sometimes, earning it means staying past dark. Tonight, I'm going to tell you 5 of those stories. 5 true accounts from 5 isolated desert towns where something happened that nobody has ever fully explained. Before we begin, I want you to ask yourself something. And I mean really ask yourself, not just let the question wash over you. Ask yourself this: if you were completely alone, in a town of 50 people, surrounded by 100 miles of empty desert in every direction, and something started happening that you couldn't explain, what would you do? Where would you go? Because in these stories, that's exactly the question the people living there had to answer. And not all of them found a good one. Let's begin. The first story takes place in a town so small that most maps don't even bother printing its name. It sits in the Sonoran Desert in southern Arizona, about 90 miles from the nearest city. The population, at its peak, was around 300 people. By the time the events I'm about to describe are taking place, that number had dropped to somewhere between 40 and 60, depending on who you asked and whether you counted the people who came and went with the seasons. The town is called Tres Hermanas, 3 sisters. It got that name from 3 rock formations that rise up just east of the town's center, tall and narrow and strangely symmetrical, like 3 figures standing with their arms at their sides, watching. Locals used to joke that the sisters were protective, that they kept bad things away. By the late 1990s, nobody was making that joke anymore. The story I'm about to tell you was documented partly through first-hand accounts collected by a journalist named Cormac Dells, who drove out to Tres Hermanas in 2001 after hearing about it from a retired sheriff's deputy in Tucson. What he found, and what he wrote, was never picked up by a major publication. The piece circulated in small regional magazines and, later, on early internet forums devoted to unexplained events in the Southwest. I want to be clear, the core events of this story are corroborated by multiple witnesses and by official records. What those records cannot explain is the part that matters. In 1997, the residents of Tres Hermanas began noticing that their animals were disappearing. It started with dogs. A border collie named Ruta, belonging to a woman named Heloise Crandall, vanished from a fenced yard on a Tuesday night in March. The fence was intact. The gate was latched. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, no tracks in the dirt beyond Ruta's own paw prints, which simply stopped about 3 feet from the fence line as if the dog had been lifted straight up into the air. Heloise reported this to the local constable, a man named Dewey Marsh, who noted it in his log and assumed a coyote had somehow gotten into the yard and dragged the dog out. But the fence was too high, and the gate was latched, and there were no coyote tracks. He wrote down what Heloise told him and moved on. Over the next 6 weeks, 11 more dogs disappeared from Trace Hermanus. Then goats. Then 2 horses. Not one animal was ever found. No remains, no blood, no evidence of predation. They simply ceased to exist. And then, in late April of 1997, the children started talking. Now, I want you to pause here for a second and really picture this. You're living in a remote desert town. You have maybe 50 neighbors. You know everyone by name. Your children play together in the same 3 or 4 streets because there are no other streets. There is no movie theater, no mall, no park. There is the school, which is one building with 2 classrooms. There is the diner. There is the gas station. There is the hardware store that doubles as the post office. And there is the desert, stretching out in every direction like a vast, indifferent ocean. Now picture your child coming home from school one afternoon and saying, very calmly, the way children sometimes say things that destroy your understanding of the world, "The man in the rock says we shouldn't go outside anymore after dinner." What do you do with that? Heloise Crandall's daughter, a 9-year-old named Prue, was the first to say something like this. She said it to her mother on a Wednesday evening in late April. Heloise, still raw from losing Ruta, asked Prue what she meant. Prue said there was a man who stood near the 3 rock formations at dusk. She said she could see him from her bedroom window. She said he was very tall and very thin and he just stood there. She said he told her things sometimes. Not out loud. In her head. She said this with complete calm, the way you might describe a neighbor you'd known your whole life. Heloise went to the window and looked toward the rock formations. In the fading evening light, the 3 tall stones did look like figures. She told herself that's all it was. Shadows. Geology. A child's imagination. She tucked Prue in and tried to sleep. By the end of May, 6 other children in Trace Hermanus were describing the same figure. Not after comparing notes at school. Before that. Independently. A boy named Orville Tasker, age 7, told his father that the tall man had asked him to leave his window open at night. A girl named Celestine Ware, age 11, drew a picture of a figure standing between the rock formations. The drawing showed someone impossibly thin, with arms that hung too low and a head that was turned at an angle that a normal neck couldn't manage. When her teacher, a woman named Della Fitch, asked Celestine about the drawing, Celestine said, "He doesn't like his picture being looked at." She said it without looking up from her desk. Della Fitch kept the drawing. Cormac Dells saw it in 2001. He described it in his article as deeply unsettling, noting that the proportions of the figure were consistent across every child's description even though the children had not discussed it together. Constable Dewey Marsh was not a superstitious man. He was ex-military, practical, the kind of man who explains everything with physics and common sense. But when he started interviewing the children himself, something shifted. He told Cormac Dells, for years later, that the thing that scared him wasn't what the children said. It was the way they said it. They weren't frightened, Marsh said. That was the problem. They were calm. Every single one of them. When you ask a kid about a monster and the kid isn't scared, that's when you get scared. The disappearances escalated in June. 3 adults reported waking in the night with a strong, inexplicable sensation that someone was in their home. Not a sound, not a sight. Just a certainty. The kind of certainty that makes you turn on every light in the house and sit with your back against a wall until morning. One of those adults was a retired schoolteacher named Absalom Greer, who had lived in Trace Hermanus for 31 years and who described himself, in his own words, as a man who did not believe in things that went bump in the night. He told Marsh that he had woken up at approximately 3 in the morning in late June and known, with absolute conviction, that something was standing at the foot of his bed. He said he lay there for what felt like 20 minutes, unable to move. Not paralyzed in the way sleep paralysis works, he was very specific about this, but simply unwilling to look. He said that eventually the sensation faded, like a drop of ink dispersing in water, and he was able to move again. He turned on the light. The room was empty. But his two cats, who had slept on his bed every night for years, were pressed into the far corner of the room with their backs against the wall, their eyes fixed on the space at the foot of the bed, making no sound at all. Absalom Greer left Tres Hermanas the next morning. He never came back. By July of 1997, the town's population had quietly dropped to around 30. People didn't make announcements. They just packed up and drove away. The ones who stayed were either too stubborn, too poor, or too something else to leave. And then, on the 14th of July, the children stopped talking about the figure. All of them, at once, on the same day. When the adults noticed and asked why, the children gave different answers, but all of the answers meant the same thing. Prue Crandall said, "He said he's done talking." Orville Tasker said, "He already knows everything he needed to know." Celestine Ware said nothing at all. She just looked toward the rock formations and smiled. That summer, Celestine Ware disappeared. She was found 3 days later, 7 miles into the desert, sitting cross-legged in the sand, completely unharmed. She had no memory of how she got there. She never drew again after that. Not pictures, not letters, nothing. She had been a child who loved to draw more than anything in the world. And one more thing. When search parties had gone looking for Celestine, 2 of the searchers reported that near the base of the 3 rock formations, they found a single set of footprints in the dry soil, leading away from the rocks, toward town. Too long for a human stride. And they didn't come back. Are you still comfortable where you're sitting? Good. Because the second story is going to ask you something different. It's going to ask you to think about what it means when an entire community decides to keep a secret. Not one person. Not 2. An entire town. The second town is in New Mexico. It's called Perdition Creek, which is not its real name. The real name has been changed at the request of a source who still lives in the area and who spoke to me on the condition of anonymity. But the events are real, and the records exist. Perdition Creek sits in the Chihuahuan Desert, east of the Rio Grande, in a valley that shouldn't really support a permanent settlement because the water table is unreliable and the wind comes from the northeast for most of the year carrying grit that gets into your teeth and your eyes and your food. The town was established in the 1880s by a small group of families, primarily of Spanish and indigenous descent, who were drawn to the area by a silver deposit that turned out to be much smaller than originally believed. When the silver played out, most of the settlers left. A few stayed. Their descendants are still there. As of 2012, Perdition Creek had a population of approximately 80 people. It had a church, a community center, a seasonal market, and a history that nobody volunteered unless you asked the right questions in the right way. The right question, it turned out, was about the lights. In 2012, a documentary filmmaker named Isolde Varon drove through Perdition Creek while scouting locations for a project about ghost towns in the Southwest. She had no intention of stopping there. She was low on gas, and the town's single gas station was the nearest one for 40 miles. While her car was being filled by a weathered man named Eulogio who spoke very little English, she noticed a cluster of faded photographs pinned to the corkboard inside the gas station's small office. The photographs were old, black and white, then early color. They all showed the same thing, a view of the desert hills to the north of town, with what appeared to be a cluster of lights hovering above the ridgeline. Different photographs, different years. Same lights, same position. She asked Eulogio about the photographs. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, in careful English, "You should finish your coffee before it gets dark." She wasn't drinking coffee. He went back to the pump. Isolde Varon stayed in Perdition Creek for 9 days. She had intended to stay for 1. What she documented over those 9 days became one of the most quietly disturbing pieces of citizen journalism to emerge from rural New Mexico in the early 21st century. It never got wide distribution because she uploaded it to a small documentary platform that later went defunct, but transcripts and summaries have circulated in paranormal research communities since then. Here is what she found. The lights over the northern ridge were a known and regular phenomenon in Perdition Creek. They had been occurring, according to the oldest residents, for as long as anyone could remember. They appeared at irregular intervals, sometimes weekly, sometimes with months between appearances. They were always at night. They were always in the same position relative to the ridgeline. And they were always, without exception, followed by something happening in the town within 24 to 72 hours. Not always something terrible, but always something that shouldn't have happened. Isolde interviewed a woman named Refugia, who was 81 years old and who had lived in Perdition Creek her entire life. Refugia told her that in 1944, the lights appeared on a Tuesday night. On Thursday, her uncle, a man who had been missing for 6 years, simply walked back into town. He was in perfect health. He had no memory of the time that had passed. He sat down at the family table and asked what was for dinner as though he'd stepped out that morning. He lived to be 92. He never mentioned those 6 years again, and the family never asked. Refugia described this with what Isolde noted as a peculiar tone of matter-of-fact acceptance. Not wonder, not fear, just acknowledgement, as if the story were as ordinary as describing a drought. But the stories weren't all that gentle. In 1968, the lights appeared on a Friday. The following Monday morning, a family of 4 who lived on the eastern edge of town were found in their home in a state that multiple witnesses described as wrong, but which they found difficult to specify further. The family was alive. They were seated at their kitchen table. They appeared to be looking at something in the center of the table. There was nothing on the table. They did not respond to knocking, shouting, or touch. They sat that way for 11 hours. Then, simultaneously, all 4 of them blinked and looked around the kitchen as though they had just arrived there. The father, a man named Crisanto, said later that he thought he had been sitting down for a moment. Just a moment. He couldn't understand why everyone looked so upset. No medical explanation was ever found. The family moved away the following year. In 1983, the lights appeared in November. 2 nights later, the church in Perdition Creek was found to have every pew rearranged. Every single pew, each one bolted to the floor, each one weighing several hundred pounds, had been moved to face away from the altar, facing the back wall. The doors of the church had been locked from the inside. There was no one inside. And written on the back wall, in a language that the local priest could not identify, was a single line of text. The priest photographed it and sent the photograph to a linguistics department at the University of New Mexico. The department identified the script as having elements consistent with several pre-Columbian writing systems but matching none precisely. The translation was attempted twice, by 2 different scholars who worked independently. Both came up with variations of the same phrase. Something like, "We have been watching since before you knew to look up." Isolde Varon saw the photograph of that wall. She included a description of it in her documentary. She also noted, and this is the part that I haven't been able to stop thinking about, that the church had been repainted 3 times since 1983. The writing was still faintly visible beneath the paint. Not because it had soaked through, but because, according to the current priest, the paint would not adhere to those specific marks. Every coat would dry perfectly everywhere else on the wall. On those marks, it would slide off, like water off glass. Now, here is what I want you to ask yourself. If you lived in Perdition Creek, and you had grown up watching those lights appear and then watching strange things happen in their wake, would you stay? Would you convince yourself it was all coincidence? Would you start to build a life around the rhythm of it, the way people build lives around the rhythm of floods or droughts? Or would the knowing eventually become its own kind of unbearable? Because that's what Isolde found in Perdition Creek. Not a town terrorized by what was happening. Not a town in denial. A town that had made its peace with something it could not explain, and that peace was in some ways more frightening than the fear would have been. On her 8th night in Perdition Creek, the lights appeared. Isolde filmed them. The footage shows a cluster of pale lights, somewhere between 4 and 7 of them, hovering at approximately consistent altitude above the northern ridge. They don't move erratically. They don't pulse or flash. They simply exist there, where nothing should be, steady and patient, for approximately 40 minutes. Then they're gone. Isolde documented everything that happened in Perdition Creek over the next 72 hours. Nothing obviously strange occurred. But she noted that on the morning after the lights appeared, every single resident of the town was outside at the same time, standing in front of their homes, or in the road, or in their yards. Not talking to each other. Just standing, looking north. All of them. Even the children. Even Eulogio at the gas station. Standing and looking toward the ridge where the lights had been. For about 20 minutes. Then, one by one, they went back inside. No one ever mentioned it. Not to her. Not to each other, as far as she could tell. On her 9th day, Isolde packed her car and prepared to leave. Eulogio filled her tank again without being asked and would not take payment. When she drove away, she looked in her rear-view mirror. The residents of Perdition Creek were standing in the road behind her, watching her go. She said, in the transcript of an interview she gave later, that the expression on their faces was not threatening, not hostile. She said it looked like pity. Let me take a breath here. And let me ask you something that I've been wondering since I first encountered these stories. Is there something about isolation, about being truly, geographically cut off from the rest of the world, that makes certain things possible? Not metaphorically possible. Literally possible. Is there something about the desert, with its extreme temperatures, its electromagnetic properties, its vast expanses of undisturbed earth, that creates conditions for experiences that simply don't occur in cities? I want to be careful here. I'm not asking you to believe in anything. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that the natural world is stranger than we give it credit for. That the desert, specifically, has been the site of documented, reported, corroborated experiences that have no satisfying conventional explanation. These aren't stories from the fringes. These are stories from geological survey teams, from military personnel stationed near test ranges, from archaeologists working dig sites in the deep Southwest, from indigenous communities who have never marketed their experiences for tourism because they are not interested in being believed by outsiders. They already know what they know. And that's the third story. The third story comes from a place called Dust Hollow. Again, not the real name, but geographically accurate. It's a small community in the western Chihuahuan Desert, sitting at the edge of a dry lake bed that was once, roughly 12,000 years ago, a significant body of water. The lake bed is now a vast flat expanse of cracked white clay, 6 miles across and almost perfectly circular. The indigenous peoples of the region, whose oral traditions predate the European presence in North America by thousands of years, have a name for the lake bed that translates roughly as the place where the earth keeps something. Not where the earth hides something. Where the earth keeps something. The distinction, explained to Isolde Varon by a community elder she interviewed separately from the Perdition Creek story, is important. Hiding implies concealment. Keeping implies intention. The town of Dust Hollow sits at the north edge of this lake bed. It was established in the 1920s by workers who came to mine gypsum from the dried lake deposits. When the mining operation closed in the 1940s, about 40 families stayed. They raised goats and grew what the land would allow, which wasn't much. By 2005, Dust Hollow had a population of around 90 people. It had a school, a bar that functioned as the town's social hub, a medical clinic staffed by a rotating roster of volunteer physicians who came for 2 weeks at a time, and a community rule that nobody talked about what happened on the lake bed. That's how it was described to me by a woman named Bernadine Scholl, who grew up in Dust Hollow and left at age 18 to attend university in El Paso. Bernadine is a geologist. She returned to Dust Hollow in 2008 to study the lake bed's mineral composition for her doctoral thesis, and what she found, both scientifically and personally, is what this story is about. The community rule about not discussing the lake bed had been in place since at least the 1950s, according to the oldest residents Bernadine interviewed. But it had never been formalized. No one had called a meeting and voted on it. It had simply emerged, the way certain community norms emerge, organically and quietly and with the weight of unspoken consensus. The reason for the rule, pieced together by Bernadine through careful and patient conversations over several months, was this: people who spent significant time on the lake bed, particularly at night, came back different. Not dramatically, not obviously, but subtly, in ways that accumulated over time. The changes were always in the same direction. They became quieter. They stopped using certain words. They developed what multiple witnesses described as a habit of looking past you, as if there were something just behind your shoulder that they were trying to see more clearly. They sometimes stopped sleeping. Not insomnia in the conventional sense. They would lie down, close their eyes, and wake up what felt to them like moments later, but hours had passed. They would have no dreams. Or rather, they would insist they had not been asleep at all, that they had been somewhere else, and they could never explain where. In the 1960s, a man named Orestes Hale spent 3 nights on the lake bed during a gypsum survey for a private company. By the time he returned to town, he had developed a behavior that his wife found so disturbing she took their children to her sister's home in Albuquerque. Every morning, Orestes would get up at 4:30, go to the edge of the lake bed that was visible from their property, and stand there until the sun was fully up. He would not eat. He would not speak. When the sun was up, he would come back inside, eat a normal breakfast, and behave normally for the rest of the day. When his wife asked him what he was doing at the edge of the lake bed, he said he was listening. When she asked to what, he said she wouldn't be able to hear it. He said it wasn't a sound. He did this every morning for 11 months. Then he stopped. He never explained why he started or why he stopped. He refused to discuss it for the rest of his life. He died in 1989. In his belongings, his daughter found a journal. It was filled, every page, front and back, with a series of marks that nobody in the family recognized. Not writing. Not drawing. Something in between. A retired cryptographer who looked at the journal on behalf of Bernadine Scholl said the marks had structural regularity consistent with encoded language, but that he could not identify the encoding system. The journal was sent to 3 different academic institutions. None of them could identify it. It remains unidentified. Now, here's where Bernadine's story takes a turn that she herself described as the moment her professional skepticism began to show serious cracks. She was conducting a standard geological survey of the lake bed. She had permits, equipment, a research assistant named Tomasz, and a clear scientific objective. She was not there to investigate the community rule or the stories she'd been collecting. She was there to take core samples and measure mineral concentrations. On her 4th day of fieldwork, in the early afternoon, working in approximately the center of the lake bed, Bernadine noticed that her equipment was behaving strangely. Her magnetometer, which measures magnetic field variation, was giving readings that she described as physically impossible given the known geology of the area. The readings were not elevated. They were oscillating, rhythmically, not randomly, not in a pattern consistent with any geological process she was aware of, but in a pattern that was regular, consistent, and cyclical. Like breathing. She recalibrated the equipment. She got the same readings. She checked the batteries, the sensors, the calibration settings. Everything was working correctly. She noted the readings and continued working. An hour later, Tomasz said something to her. He said it quietly, the way you say something when you're not sure you should say it at all. He said, "Do you hear that?" She didn't. She said so. He said it was a low frequency, barely audible. He cupped his hands over his ears and turned slowly in a circle, trying to locate the direction. He ended up facing east, toward the center of the lake bed. He stood there for a while. Then he said, "I think we should go back." They went back. That night, Bernadine couldn't sleep. She lay in the small room she was renting from a woman named Guadalupe and stared at the ceiling. At some point in the night, she became convinced that something was standing outside her window. Not a person. She described it as a density, a thickness in the air on the other side of the glass. She did not look. She told me, in the kind of voice people use when they're being very precise about something they know sounds irrational, that she had made a conscious decision not to look. She said she didn't know why. She said it felt like a decision she'd made before she knew she was making it. In the morning, the sand outside her window showed marks she couldn't explain. Not footprints, but disturbances. As if something with no particular shape had been resting against the ground, pressing into it for some time. She photographed them. When she looked at the photographs on her camera's screen, the marks were visible. When she uploaded the photographs to her laptop that evening, the files were corrupted. All of them. Only those files. Everything else on the memory card was intact. Bernadine Scholl completed her geological survey and wrote a thesis that made no mention of any of this. She told me that her thesis findings were themselves unusual, that the mineral composition of the lake bed showed evidence of a heat event of extraordinary magnitude at a depth and dating that didn't correspond to any known geological event in the region's history. Something had happened there, underground, and the Earth had recorded it the way the Earth always records things, in the language of minerals and strata and the slow testimony of stone. Something had happened, a long time ago, and she is not certain it was finished. Now I want you to think about this. Here's the question I want you to sit with. If the Earth itself can record events, if the land can hold something the way a room holds the memory of a sound, what would it mean to build a town on top of that recording? What would it mean to live there? To raise children there? To sleep there, night after night, on soil that has been keeping something for 12,000 years? I don't have an answer. But I think the people of Dust Hollow do. And I think that's why the rule exists. The fourth story is different in texture from the others. It's not about something lurking at the edge of vision or lights in the sky or marks in the sand. It's about people. Specifically, it's about what people do to each other when they are alone enough and frightened enough and have been sitting with something unspoken for long enough. This story takes place in a town in the Mojave Desert in California. The town's real name I will not use here, though it is a matter of public record and has been reported on by the Los Angeles Times, the Sacramento Bee, and several regional publications. I will call it Caldera. Population, at the time of the events, 112. The year, 2003. Caldera had a single main road, a volunteer fire department, a small general store, and a school that served grades kindergarten through 8th. High schoolers were bused 40 miles to the nearest high school district. The town had existed since the 1930s, when it was a service community for a now-defunct railway line. When the railway stopped running, the town should have died. It almost did. But a combination of stubbornness, poverty, and a small but fierce community identity kept it alive. By 2003, Caldera was the kind of town that outsiders described as hanging on, which is a polite way of saying that most of its residents had nowhere else to go and were too proud to admit it. The school principal in 2003 was a woman named Ren Maccabee, who had moved to Caldera from Phoenix 14 years earlier, following a divorce, looking for quiet and finding it in the specific and total way that only the deep desert provides. She was 46, practical, well-liked, and not given to drama. She is the primary source for most of what I'm about to tell you, because she kept records. Not official records, necessarily. But she kept a detailed personal journal, entries dated and timed, beginning in January of 2003 and ending abruptly in September of the same year. The journal was shared with a researcher named Piotr Lemke, who was compiling a study of social behaviors in isolated communities. He shared relevant portions of it with permission, and with identifying details altered. The year 2003 in Caldera began normally. The school year started well, enrollment was stable, and there had been no significant unusual events in the community for some time. But in February, a family moved into a house on the north end of town. The house had been empty for 9 years. The family consisted of a mother, a father, and 3 children. Their name, for the purposes of this story, was the Vaughn family. Their first name was never collectively used. They were referred to by residents as the Vaughns in a way that had weight and hesitation in it, the way you say the name of a weather event. From the beginning, something about the Vaughn family made the residents of Caldera uncomfortable. Ren Maccabee noted this in her journal as early as their 3rd week in town. She wrote that the children, 2 boys and a girl, were enrolled in her school and were in every academic sense completely normal students. They were quiet, polite, attentive, and caused no disciplinary issues. But the other children avoided them. Not because of any social conflict or cruelty. Simply because, as one child reportedly put it to her mother, they make me feel like I'm forgetting something important. The father, a man Ren called Mr. V in her journal, came into the school within the first week to introduce himself and discuss his children's educational needs. She described the meeting in her journal as professionally normal and personally deeply unsettling in a way she could not pinpoint. She wrote, "He said all the right things. He was polite and warm and asked all the right questions about curriculum and extracurriculars. But I spent the entire meeting feeling like I was talking to someone who was performing the idea of a concerned parent rather than actually being one. Like he had studied the role and was executing it very well. I've met parents who didn't care about their kids before, and that's not what this was. This was different. I'm not sure how." The Vaughn family attended community events. They came to the school play in March. They participated in the volunteer cleanup day in April. They were, by every observable metric, model new residents of Caldera. But over the spring of 2003, a pattern emerged in Ren's journal that she herself didn't seem to fully notice as she was writing it. Every community event the Vaughn family attended was followed, within a few days, by some small but distinct shift in the community's behavior. After the school play, 2 families who had been close friends for 20 years stopped speaking to each other over what onlookers described as nothing at all, a misunderstanding about parking. After the cleanup day, 3 separate residents independently reported losing stretches of time over the following week. Not dramatically. An hour here. An afternoon there. The feeling of having done something without remembering doing it. After the 4th of July celebration, a man named Craddock Sims, who had been the most vocal and gregarious person in Caldera for as long as anyone could remember, stopped talking entirely. Not because of a medical event. Not because of depression, as far as anyone could tell. He simply stopped. He would open his mouth and then close it, as if he'd decided against whatever he'd been about to say. As if every sentence he started didn't quite feel worth completing. This went on for 6 weeks. Then he disappeared. He was found walking along the main road at 2 in the morning, 3 weeks later, about 8 miles from town. He had no explanation. He resumed talking normally after that, but everyone who knew him said he was different. He stopped making jokes. He stopped asking questions. He listened more than he spoke. He watched. By August, Ren Maccabee was writing in her journal with increasing desperation. She was trying to articulate something she couldn't quite name. She wrote, "I don't know how to say this without sounding like I've lost my mind, but I think something is draining out of this town. Not physically. Something else. The quality of it. The character of it. Things that made Caldera feel like itself are disappearing, and I can't identify what's replacing them, because I'm not sure anything is replacing them. It's like there's a hole where the heart of this place used to be." In late August, she made a decision. She drove to the Vaughn house unannounced, on a Saturday morning. She brought a pie, because that's what you do in Caldera when you visit someone. She knocked on the door. The mother answered. Wren described her as pleasant and welcoming, and said the inside of the house was perfectly ordinary. Furniture, books, a kitchen that smelled of coffee. She sat down and had a cup of coffee and ate a slice of her own pie and made conversation. Everything was normal. And then one of the Vaughn children walked through the kitchen, the youngest boy, maybe 6 years old. He stopped when he saw Wren. He looked at her for a moment. And then he said, and she wrote this down word for word as soon as she got home, "You should stop thinking about us. It doesn't help, and it just makes us curious about you." The mother appeared not to have heard this. She just kept refilling Wren's coffee cup. Wren left a few minutes later. She went directly home and wrote everything in her journal. The entry ends with 2 sentences. First, he said it like a warning. Second, he said it like a kindness. The Vaughn family left Caldera in September of 2003. No announcement. No goodbye. The house was empty on a Thursday morning. They left every piece of furniture. Every belonging. The refrigerator was full of food. The lights were on. The beds were made. They left as if they had stepped out for a moment and simply decided, somewhere along the way, not to come back. After they left, the community of Caldera did not immediately recover what it had lost. It was more gradual than that. But over the following year, things did improve. The families who had stopped speaking made up, awkwardly and without fully understanding why they'd stopped. Craddock Sims began making jokes again. The general atmosphere of the town began to resemble what it had been before February. Except for one thing. Nobody would discuss the Vaughns. Not because of any agreed-upon rule. Simply because, when anyone tried to bring them up, they found they couldn't quite remember what they looked like. The details would slip. The father's face. The children's names. The mother's voice. The longer it went on, the less anyone could retrieve. By 2005, most residents of Caldera had only the vaguest memory that a new family had moved in and then moved out. By 2010, several people Piotr Lemke spoke to had no memory of the Vaughn family at all. Wren Maccabee remembered. She had the journal. She went back and read it and recognized her own handwriting describing things she no longer had any memory of experiencing. She found this disturbing in a specific way. She told Piotr, "It's not like forgetting a name. It's like those 2 entries were written by someone who had access to my hands and my pen and my thoughts, but who wasn't quite me. I know that sounds crazy. But reading those entries is like reading someone else's diary." She paused then and added, "What worries me is that I think I was fully myself when I wrote them. I think the strange part isn't the writing. I think the strange part is what I am now." We're almost at the end. But I want to make sure you're still with me, because the 5th story is the one that has stayed with me the longest. It's the one I keep coming back to. And it's the one that, of all 5, has the most documented evidence behind it, the most corroborated witnesses, and the most unresolved questions. It takes place in the deepest part of the Sonoran Desert, in a town so isolated that reaching it requires 40 miles of unpaved road, a vehicle with high clearance, and the kind of patience that is really just stubbornness with better branding. The town is called, in this story, Vergara's End. It had a population of around 35 people in 2015. It had existed continuously since 1862, which makes it one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in the region. It had survived the Apache Wars. It had survived the collapse of its silver and copper mines. It had survived drought and flood and the slow suffocation of being forgotten by the modern world. The people who lived there were not there by accident. They were there because they wanted to be. Because they had chosen the specific quality of life that comes from being far from everything. And that is not a small or incidental detail. It matters for what comes next. In the summer of 2015, a documentary team consisting of 4 people drove into Vergara's End to make a short film about remote desert communities. The team was led by a director named Sloane Ketrick, a woman in her late 30s who had spent most of her career making films about disappearing ways of life in the American West. She was accompanied by her camera operator, a man named Dalehurst, a sound recordist named Petra Voss, and a production assistant named Crisanto Reyes, who also served as the team's Spanish interpreter. They arrived in Vergara's End on the 17th of June and planned to stay for 2 weeks. They stayed for 22 days. They left 1 person short. Crisanto Reyes disappeared on the 19th day. He was found 11 days later, 60 miles away, in perfect physical health, with no memory of the intervening time. His camera, which he had with him when he disappeared, contained footage that has never been made fully public. Excerpts have been described by people who have seen it. I will tell you what those people said. But first, the context. When the documentary team arrived in Vergara's End, they were received with cautious hospitality. The residents were not unfriendly, but they were not eager. They had been approached by journalists and filmmakers before and had universally found the experience unsatisfying, which is a diplomatic way of saying they had learned that outsiders usually came looking for a story they'd already written and were annoyed when the reality didn't cooperate. Sloane Ketrick was different, in that she was genuinely curious and genuinely patient. She was willing to sit with people and let them talk at their own pace. Over the first week, she began building real relationships. She had dinner with a woman named Xiomara, who was 74 and who had been born in Vergara's End and had never lived anywhere else. She spent a morning helping a man named Ferold repair a fence. She drove the town's single schoolteacher, a young woman named Reina, to collect supplies from a cache 40 miles down the road. In these conversations, a theme emerged that Sloane found puzzling. When she asked residents what they liked most about living in Vergara's End, the answers were what she expected. The quiet, the sky, the sense of self-sufficiency, the community. But when she asked what they liked least, or what they found hardest, she expected to hear about the physical challenges of desert life. The heat, the isolation, the logistical difficulties. Instead, almost every resident said a variation of the same thing. They said the hardest thing was what happened in late summer. They said it with a kind of resigned acceptance. They said it without dramatic emphasis. They said it the way farmers talk about difficult weather. Just part of it. Just something that came every year and had to be gotten through. Sloane asked what happened in late summer. Several of them were evasive. A few changed the subject. But Xiomara, the 74-year-old who had become the team's most willing interview subject, told her. She told her over the course of 3 separate conversations, as if she needed to parcel it out, as if telling it all at once would be too much. Here is what Xiomara said. Every year, in late summer, roughly between the end of July and the middle of September, the dreams changed. Everyone in Vergara's End had the same experience. Not the same dream. The same quality of dream. A quality of dream that was, in Xiomara's words, too real to be inside your head. In these dreams, you were in Vergara's End. Exactly as it was. Your house, your street, your neighbors. But there was something else there too. Something that moved through the town at night. You could feel it in the dream, but you couldn't see it clearly. It was as if you were a few degrees off from being able to look directly at it. And it was curious. She used that word specifically. Not dangerous. Not malevolent. Curious. It moved through the town and it looked at things. It went through houses. Not to take anything. Just to look. To examine. And if it became aware of you watching it in the dream, it would stop. And it would look back. And Xiomara said, in the flat, certain tone of someone describing a fact, that no one who had made eye contact with it in the dream had ever been quite the same afterward. She said it wasn't damage. It was more like change. She said some of the people it had looked back at were the most interesting people she had ever known. She said some of them had left and never come back. She said 2 of them, in her lifetime, had simply sat down one day and not gotten up again. Not from illness. Not from injury. Just from what the doctors, who eventually drove out from the nearest city, described as a kind of deep and terminal quietness. As if they had decided, at some fundamental level, to stop. Sloane filmed all of this. She was professional. She was measured. She did not editorialize. But she was shaken. Dale Hurst noticed, because he said she started asking him to walk back to the accommodation with her instead of going alone at night, which was something she had never done before. On the 19th day of the team's stay, Crisanto Reyes asked if he could spend the morning doing some secondary filming on his own. He wanted to capture some B-roll footage. Establishing shots of the town, the landscape. Sloane said yes. He took the small secondary camera and went out after breakfast. He did not come back for lunch. By evening, with no sign of him, Sloane called the sheriff's office. A search was organized. Crisanto had last been seen walking east, toward the dry, rocky hills that bordered the town on that side. Searchers found his footprints in the sand. The footprints led for about 1.5 miles into the desert. Then they stopped. Not at a road, not at a rocky surface where tracks would become invisible. In open sand. The footprints simply stopped. Like Ruta the border collie, 20 years earlier and 1,000 miles away. Like they'd been lifted from the earth. Crisanto Reyes was found 11 days later, 60 miles south, walking along a state road. He was physically fine. He was calm. He said he felt rested. He had no memory of the 11 days. He did have the camera. When the footage was reviewed, it showed the following. The first 40 minutes of footage were standard B-roll. The town, the hills, the sky, the textures of the desert. Then there was a gap of several seconds of static. Then the footage resumed, but it was different. The camera was being held by someone, presumably Crisanto, but the footage was from an angle and a perspective that multiple people who reviewed it said felt wrong. Not technically wrong. Perceptually wrong. As if the camera were recording from a position that didn't quite correspond to where a person holding it would be standing. The footage showed, over the course of approximately 12 minutes, a view of Vergara's End from above. From high above. Thousands of feet above. Clear, stable, detailed footage of the town and the surrounding desert, shot from an altitude that a person could not physically occupy without being in an aircraft. There was no aircraft. The footage ended. After that, the remaining recording on the camera was static, and then darkness, and then, near the end, a single frame. One frame. Sloane Ketrick described it to a journalist who interviewed her about the documentary, which was eventually released in a different, much shorter form with the unexplained elements significantly downplayed. She said the single frame showed Vergara's End as seen from directly above. As if the camera, or whatever was carrying it, had been directly overhead. And in the frame, in the streets and yards of the town, you could see the residents of Vergara's End. All of them. Going about their morning. Unknowing. Unaware. Xiomara tending her garden. Ferold at the fence. Reyna walking to the schoolhouse. And standing at the edge of the frame, at the very border of the image, something else. Something that wasn't one of the residents. Too large for the scale. Too still for something alive. Too present. Just standing at the edge of everything. At the edge of the frame, at the edge of the town, at the edge of what the camera could see. Standing, the way the three sisters stood in Tres Hermanas. The way a watcher stands. Patient. Permanent. Not passing through. The documentary team left Vergara's End the following morning. Sloan Ketrick has not made another film since. Dale Hurst told the journalist that the night before they left, he woke at approximately 3 in the morning and looked out his window. He said all of the residents of Vergara's End were outside, standing in the road, looking up at the sky, not talking. He watched them for a few minutes. Then he closed the curtain and lay back down. He said he thought about looking back out. He decided, the way Bernadine Scholl had decided not to look out her window, not to. He said it was the best decision he'd ever made. And he said that to this day, he doesn't know why he believes that. He just does. Now let me come back to you. Because I want to end with something that I think ties all 5 of these stories together. Something that isn't a supernatural theory, not quite, but is an observation that I think matters. These 5 towns, Tres Hermanas, Perdition Creek, Dust Hollow, Caldera, Vergara's End, are not unique. There are dozens of places like them scattered across the American Southwest. Hundreds, if you count the ones that are mostly or entirely abandoned. Each of them has, in its own way, a version of one of these stories. Something that doesn't fit. Something that the residents live alongside and don't advertise. Something that their children absorb and their elders acknowledge, and their newcomers either accept or flee. There is a theory, and I want to be very explicit that this is a theory, that certain places accumulate experience the way physical objects accumulate wear. That the desert, because of its age, its electromagnetic properties, its geological composition, and its relative freedom from the kind of constant human interference that characterizes urban environments, is particularly susceptible to this accumulation. That the things that happen in these towns happen not because of anything the residents have done or failed to do, but because of where they have chosen to live. Because of the land beneath them. Because of what the land keeps. There is another theory, and this one comes from indigenous scholars who have studied and documented the oral traditions of the peoples who inhabited this region for thousands of years before European contact. The theory, which is perhaps better described as a knowledge claim, is this: the desert has never been empty. It has never been the kind of absence that European settlers perceived when they arrived and named these landscapes wilderness and wasteland. The desert was full. It has always been full. Full of things that precede human presence. Things that have been here longer than memory. Things that observe and examine and occasionally intersect with human lives, not out of malice, not out of affection, but out of the kind of deep, geological curiosity that has no need to explain itself. And the people who built towns on the desert surface have been living, whether they know it or not, as guests in a place that was already occupied. Most of the time, the occupants are not interested. They have longer concerns, older preoccupations. But sometimes something draws their attention. A community, a family, a child with a gift for drawing, a dog that vanished without tracks, a filmmaker who asked the right questions. And then the attention comes, slow and enormous and patient, the way geological things are always patient, and the people in its focus are changed by it, or lost to it, or marked by it in ways that can be read in the lines of their faces for the rest of their lives. I don't know if that theory is true. I don't know if any of the explanations I've offered tonight are true. But I know the stories are. I know the records exist. I know the photographs were taken, and the journals were written, and the footprints stopped in open sand, and the footage showed an impossible altitude, and the children drew a figure with arms that hung too low, and none of it has ever been explained. And I know that somewhere out there, right now, in the deep desert southwest, in one of the small towns I haven't told you about yet, someone is looking out their window at 3 in the morning. They're looking toward the place where something is standing in the dark, and they are making a decision to look or not to look. And they already know, the way Dale Hurst knew, the way Bernadine Scholl knew, the way every single person in every single one of these towns eventually came to know, that some decisions, once made, cannot be unmade. The desert doesn't forget. It keeps things. And if you stay long enough, quiet enough, still enough, it will keep you too. And the last question I want to leave you with, the one I want you to sit with tonight when you turn off this recording and try to sleep, is this: how well do you actually know the place where you live? How long has your land been here? What happened on it before you arrived? What is underneath you right now, remembering? Sleep well, if you can, because there are more stories where these came from. And some of them are about places closer to you than you'd like to think.